Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Gerard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Welcome to the Killer Women podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air Global Network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Gerard, and my guest today is Robyn Harding. Robyn is the best-selling author of The Perfect Family, The Arrangement, Her Pretty Face, and The Party, which was a finalist for the Arthur Ellis Award for Best Crime Novel. Her book, The Swap, debuted at #1 on the Globe and Mail and Toronto Star Canadian bestseller lists. She is the screenwriter and executive producer of the independent film The Steps, and she lives in Vancouver, British Columbia with her family and 2 cute but deadly rescue chihuahuas. Welcome, Robyn.
Thank you so much for having me, Danielle.
Oh, it's so fun. And I am a fan. I've read most of your books. I've missed a couple in the beginning, but I love The Drowning Woman. And before we talk about all the things about this book and your characters and plot and all the fun stuff, can you please tell our listeners who don't know about The Drowning Woman what this story is about?
Of course. So, The Drowning Woman is about a woman named Lee who was a very successful restaurateur. She was a chef and owned her own restaurant, which she lost during the pandemic. And because she made some poor choices, she ends up kind of on the run and living in her car. And she's feeling very vulnerable, as a woman would, living in her car. So she decides to sleep. She drives up north to a very wealthy seaside enclave outside Seattle. And this is where she sort of sets up camp and is sleeping in her car. And one pre-dawn morning, she hears one of the women from these beautiful cliffside mansions trying to drown herself in the ocean. And on instinct, Lee runs in and saves this woman's life. But the woman, Hazel, is not grateful because she was trying to commit suicide because she's in a very abusive marriage. And an unlikely friendship forms between these two women from different ends of the spectrum who are both drowning in their own ways. And then one day, Hazel asks Lee to help her disappear. And things go crazy from there.
They do go crazy. It's such a fun story. So I always like to ask this question because I think it's so interesting how stories develop and where they come from. Do you remember sort of the seed of the story, where the idea came from?
Yes. So this is such a convoluted way to get to this story that it almost doesn't make sense. But this is how it came to me. So I was asleep one night, or I wasn't asleep, I guess. I should have been asleep, but I was lying awake. And I was warm and I had the windows open. And there was a woman outside on the street having a phone conversation, and I could hear every single word. And I thought, she has no idea that someone is listening to her side of the conversation. And so I started thinking about overhearing things. My crime writer brain started going, what if she said something like she was planning a crime, or she was suicidal, or what have you? And I was like, what do you do if it's a complete stranger? How would you intervene? And then I thought, well, I guess I'd probably call the police. And I thought, but what if I didn't have a phone? What if I had no way to call the police? And then I started thinking about living in your car. And then, I wrote this as we were coming out of the pandemic. And, women, a lot of people were affected more than others were, as we, all experienced this, some different industries and marginalized communities and low income people and women, like domestic abuse soared.
Yeah.
Women-owned businesses were more likely to fail, I think, because of the other pressures that kind of tend to fall on women. And so I just started thinking about two women suffering in different ways and how I could sort of use that overhearing or scenario. And yeah, so that was very convoluted, but that's
no, but I actually think that's oftentimes how these stories come to us, right? It's like one little weird thing that we see in the course of a normal day or night, and then it sort of just all spirals, and then you think, well, what if it's that, and what if it's that, and how would this woman be most vulnerable? And I love that that's the thought process. And I want to touch on a moment at what you talk about, because first of all, coming out of the pandemic is so, I mean, I know authors are sort of split on no book will ever be set after 2019 because we're never going to touch the pandemic. And then the idea that it never happened, and so ignore it completely. But I love the way that, like, restaurants, I mean, we're in a small town, and one of the things we tried to do was order takeout from all these restaurants that were really, really suffering through the pandemic. So I do feel like Lee's story resonates very much. And I want to talk about because this is Killer Women, I want to talk about the impact that the pandemic had, particularly on women, and the pressures that, that hit us, or our gender harder than others. And so, in that way, I think it's really wonderful that you're shining a light on that. So can you talk to me a little bit about, what your research shows and how you sort of adopted that into Lee's story?
Yeah. So I had a personal connection to the whole restaurant thing, and that my brother and his husband both worked in hospitality. My brother-in-law is a chef and my brother was a bartender. And I live in Vancouver, which is a very expensive city. And they left the city. They moved to a smaller town that was more affordable. And they're just like, we can't do it. We're so out of work. And they're not women, but anyway, touch on the restaurant side of things. So they've landed on their feet and it all worked out well, but it was just so disruptive. And a quote I heard during as we were coming out of the pandemic and the lockdown, and how people would say things like, oh, we're all in the same boat. And I heard a quote that said, no, we're not. We're all in the same storm, but we're in very different boats.
Right.
So, I thought about like the being locked down together with people. Imagine if you are in a bad relationship, and how many relationships turned to violence under the stress. I mean, we're all probably suffering, some sort of global PTSD from what we went through. Like, we didn't know, it was very scary.
Yeah.
Didn't really know, and was life ever going to be the same again? And
right.
it was so stressful. And imagine a bad marriage, or children, with a abusive parents, I mean, it's just so horrible. And so I didn't want to write a book set in the pandemic, but I feel like we were all changed by it. We were all impacted, and that was just weighing heavy on my mind as I was writing. And women, like they say, women-owned businesses suffered more. Women defaulted on loans more, and I think it was because there's a lot more domestic responsibilities that land on women. So when you add another layer to things,
right.
and homeschooling. What about kids that had to like homeschool? My kids are older.
My
daughter was at university and she had to come home, but she was
Mine
grown
too.
up.
Yeah.
She could go online. Imagine having a 6-year-old and a 8-year-old or something, and you have to add that to the list. I mean, I'm not saying dads couldn't do it too, but
I think some dads did do it, but I think proportionately it fell on women, and women's careers, to your point, took a huge step backwards because women could not do it all. I mean, you can't homeschool 2 children and also be present at your job all day. That is not possible. And if you're in the restaurant business, and to your point about your brother and his husband, that's another group that is, they're not women, but they're oftentimes marginalized group as well. So it's not just women. I talk about women because it's
low
killer
income
women.
people, like any marginalized people. It's just, I mean, I think it was hard for all of us, but it was harder for specific communities, definitely.
Absolutely. So let's talk about Hazel and Lee, because one of the things I love about them is how different they are, and yet how weirdly similar their circumstances are. Because both of these women in the story are really helpless and alone in very different ways. Obviously, one has she sort of has access to everything she could possibly need, right? Hazel lives in a beautiful home, and money's not going to be a worry for her, and yet she has less freedom in a weird way than this woman who has
Yeah.
zero money and lives in her car and is estranged from her family and has lost her, so there's sort of an underlying theme about, independence. How do you create independence when we're so dependent on, oftentimes, on men? And I sort of,
Right.
I'd love to have you explore, talk to us about that, because I think that's a huge theme and a wonderfully, and when I say themes, like, it's a page turner. This isn't the kind of book where you're going to be like, well, immersed in theme and I feel like I'm independent. It's not like that at all. I just like to draw out the
Hey.
threads that follow through and sort of how explore those, because they're so interesting.
Yeah, thank you. So with Hazel, she's married a very, very wealthy man. And I've explored this theme before in The Arrangement, which is about a sugar daddy relationship that goes really wrong. And I did a ton of research for that book, which sort of informed sort of the backstory of Hazel about why women would make these choices, right? And no judgment, like people are in situations where women are in situations, or it doesn't have to be women, where you make a choice that might work out. Sometimes it does work out. Sometimes it works out completely fine, and other times it doesn't. And for Hazel, I think she has feelings for Benjamin at the beginning. He's attractive. He's a lawyer. He's successful and wealthy. But he wants something from her that she bites off more than she can chew. So it starts out as a master slave relationship, which, if that is consensual and that is your bag, both of you, then that's totally cool.
Absolutely.
But it turns into something where he's not following the rules. Like, there are rules in these relationships. I did a lot of research on this as well. And both partners need to be satisfied from that dynamic, and Hazel stops being satisfied by it, and it starts to go darker and darker until there are no rules and she's basically a prisoner. It gets very, very dark for her.
Yeah.
Yeah,
She is
but
a prisoner. Which is an interesting thing to explore, is that these we think about prisoner. I mean, we think, of course, there's women who are, there's actual prisoners, right? Girls and women who are abducted, but you can be very much a prisoner, and and live on the outside, and people can look at your life and envy it and think, oh wow, she's got it made. And yet the prison is set up so that you can't share. I mean, she cannot ask for help.
yes.
She is Hazel is it is the ultimate catch-22 for her. And
Yeah,
of course,
sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, of course, that's what you want to explore in this book, is this, because it's so interesting.
Yeah, she's got a beautiful home. She's got beautiful clothes. She's allowed to go out for lunches to keep up the facade of things, but she's under his ultimate control. And it's like, why does any woman stay with an abuser? There's so many layers to that
Yeah.
question, right? And Hazel in this case has a mom who's in very expensive memory care, and she can't afford that without him. So that's another complication for her to try to break free.
Right. And that, I mean, it's a really, and they're really, her mom was a single mom and raised her on her own. And, so they had, money had become, and as it often does in these situations, and kind of for all of us at some level, that sort of like, what do we do in order to be comfortable? What am I willing to sacrifice so that my mother has, the care she needs, and I have a roof over my head? And it seems relatively simple in the beginning, right? And then it snowballs into at least for some, and for Hazel, it snowballs into a really, really difficult situation. There was another really fascinating thing that I loved. It's on the actually very first page of the book. It's actually the first line of the book,
Yeah.
which talks about, and I'm going to read it. In sociological terms, they call it the fundamental attribution error. Basically, it means that when people see someone in a bad situation, they tend to believe that individual brought it on themselves. So I wanted to explore that too, because I think that's a really interesting thing. Like and I think we all a little bit susceptible of that. So can you talk to us about that? And, that's interesting.
Honestly, don't you think that is why when we watch like Dateline or true crime documentaries, we're like as your internal voice, at least mine is going, well, I wouldn't do that. Oh, I would see through that, right? We all tell ourselves that we would make different choices. And as much as we try to have empathy for people, we think, well, clearly we are just superior to that person in decisions we make, and we'd never end up that way. And that's what I wanted to show with her, is that literally anybody could end up homeless, like it's very, and she's not addicted. There's a huge homelessness issue in my city. I would say there's so much addiction and mental health issues, which again, that's not someone's fault, right? The things happen that, like, you're in pain, that no one says, oh, I think I would like to be a drug addict on the street. In my opinion, no one says that.
I would agree. I don't think anybody says that. No.
Some people think that. Some people think it's like, oh, a homeless voice and stuff like that. But I think that people are suffering and they're in pain and can't sort out mental health issues, and drugs are an escape from their own suffering and
pain.
From pain. And so anyway, with Lee, I wanted to show that she was like, she had it going on. Like she had her own restaurant, and I wrote a prequel short story that you get if you pre-order later. But I wrote a prequel short story about her when she owned her restaurant.
And, I love that that's out there. Well, I hope you'll publish it in an ebook form, or make it available to people.
I'll ask about that. I'm not sure it's currently a pre-order incentive, but if we could maybe do that, because it shows her when she was running the show and juggling all these things, and there's a hint of what's to come with her shady investor and how it's all going to go so wrong. But she was like a huge success story, and she ends up losing everything and living in her car. And so I want to show that.
And that very first scene, it's very harrowing. She's sleeping in her car, and she's sleeping kind of behind the camper of a couple that feels like a sort of a safety net, but there are people patrolling those streets, and she has men attack the car, and I can feel her terror. And what an incredibly long way to drop, right? To have had your own business and to be so successful, and then all of a sudden to literally be prey for these people on the street. It's a beautifully done opening, because we're like, oh my gosh, this woman, this is this is a really such a hard thing. Very hard.
I talked to a friend of mine who was a homelessness outreach worker for years. And so I thought, well, I can imagine what it would be like, right? I can just make that up in my brain. But when I talked to him, I'm like, literally the first thing he said is, where will she get a weapon? It's the very first thing he said, that every person now, but particularly every woman, would need to arm herself. And they did recently there was a study or a survey done in Vancouver, talking to homeless women, and 100% of them had been sexually assaulted, self-identifying women, 100%. So, it would just be a matter of time for her.
Oh,
yeah.
Right.
So,
God.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, because I know, obviously in America, or in the US, things are it's such a mess, and our system is so broken. And I always think of Canada as being a little bit more like, put together. So hopefully I'm not wrong, but it's a mess.
It's really bad here. The thing about Vancouver is we have the best weather for if you are living on the streets. A lot of people come here because you can survive. You can't survive the winter on the streets in Manitoba or Quebec or Ontario. It's, there's shelter space, but it's just an easier place. People camp here. And so there's so many hurdles to getting the safety net that we do offer. But this book is set in the States. So
Yes, right, in Seattle. Yes, absolutely.
we still have social probably more social support, but you can't get it without an address. You can't get a welfare check without an address, right?
Right,
Right. So it's
interesting.
so tricky. And then someone told me, I don't know if you know about this, but I was actually talking to producers about this, who are interested in optioning this book. And she said in America, you have to prove you've been homeless for 2 years before you can get any support.
I didn't
I
know
don't know
that.
if that's true. I don't know if that's true, but that's what she told me.
2 years.
2 years. Imagine the damage that you have suffered, the abuse and if you're not self-medicating by then with drugs,
Right.
well, I mean, it's just it's unbelievable.
It's
So
it's unbelievable. And yeah, and Seattle, I mean, I'm from San Francisco originally. I'm in Montana now, where it is harder, of course, to survive the winter homeless. But in San Francisco, it is, it is absolutely just,
yeah,
I mean, it's insane. It's totally
my
insane.
husband was just there for business, and he said his hotel was right on the edge of the Tenderloin,
Yeah.
and he said it was unbelievable. Like it's called the Downtown East Side in Vancouver, and it's really the saddest thing you've ever seen. Like it's just
Yeah. I mean, it's really these tent cities. I know, I'm sure you've seen them in Seattle, and you probably have them there too. It is really, really, it is really, really, it's, yeah, we're in bad shape. So, well, but the book, I mean, really, the that just goes to say that that the foundation of the book is based on feels so authentic and legitimate, and it really does raise the stakes for Lee, who is, like you said, it's a matter of time before she knows that. I mean, it's very clear that she knows how much danger she's in, and she's trying to figure out, she can't, and then of course the men take her purse, which I don't think I'm giving anything away, because then she can't even get, like, she can't get a legitimate job because she has no
yeah,
identification. I mean, it really just goes from bad to worse.
yeah. It's when you lose all that, it's virtually impossible to get back on your feet. So, and
Yeah,
she's working homeless, right? She's working
right,
under the table, but she's working, but it's not enough, right? There's so
right.
many jobs that are not paying enough to cover a roof over your head, let alone food. And
Yeah, right. No, absolutely. That's exactly right. So you've written, I mean, quite a few books. I want to hear about your process. And there's always this sort of like plotter pantser thing, and I think there's a lot of variations of that. It's not exactly one camp or the other, but I would love to hear sort of how you write books now. What's your process?
so I would say I'm a loose plotter. I'm definitely a plotter, but not, I know people who write a 15-page outline with every scene. I'm not like that. I hate writing outlines, but I have written a lot of books. This is my 13th book.
Oh, congratulations.
Lucky 13, I hope.
Yes, absolutely.
I used to write back, like I've been writing for 19 years. I've been
Hmm.
publishing, and I was writing kind of chick lit, which I guess you would now be called a rom-com. That's how I started. And then I took a break and did some screenwriting for probably 5-6 years. And then I got back into writing novels and went to the dark side. And now I write thrillers.
Yeah.
So I think when I wrote rom-coms, I was definitely a pantser. I was just like, I'd have a bit of an idea and I'd just go with it. And it seemed to work for most of them anyway. But then I think what I learned from screenwriting, I really apply to writing thrillers. And I think with a mystery, for me, it's very helpful to kind of plot out some sort of structure. So I do follow that 3-act structure of a screenplay and hit those plot points at certain stages of the book to try to keep the pacing up. So I kind of plot out those main beats, and then I write towards them. And how do I get there? Here's what I want to happen in as we get into the first act, and what's got to happen to take me to that point, and then what's
Yeah.
gonna have to happen to get me to the midpoint, and what's gonna, so it's become, you know, it's a really inherent story structure that we have all grown up with, but seeing it sort of laid out on a piece of paper. Some people use the stickies all over the wall, but
Right.
I'm not that, I'm too lazy, basically. I just do it on a piece of paper, but I find it really helpful with a thriller and a mystery to keep that pacing up and like pace.
Yeah, and so tell us, I know a lot of people that the Beats, sort of like Save the Cat,
Yeah.
which is a great book for people who, you know, are starting out in, and I would say I'm probably up pretty much on the same page that you are, and it sounds like we've been publishing for about the same amount of time.
Oh,
But it's but I think I want to talk. I'd love to hear a little bit about your screenwriting experience, because that's a really interesting, like, sort of what made you pivot, and you know what. I mean, I know you learned a ton of things from writing screenplays, but can you, you know, synthesize a couple of them for us? I'd be curious to hear sort of how that's adjusted, changed your writing.
yeah. It's amazing how much I learned from that. And some of it is that it's impossible almost.
Fair, fair.
I literally, like, I had a bit of a idyllic first novel experience like 19 years ago. I just like, oh, I'm just gonna bang out this novel, and then I just sold it, which I know now is not realistic, and to sell your first book. And I think maybe I was delusional and thought, oh, I can do anything now. So it was sort of a blessing and a curse, because, you know, as you know, writing careers are like this usually, not
Yes,
like the trajectory.
yes.
So I had a lot of stuff optioned. And I still continue, luckily, knock on wood. I get a lot of my books get optioned, whether they go anywhere or not. But it's nice to have that interest. And so when I first started writing, and stuff got optioned, I thought, well, there's clearly something cinematic in my voice and my ideas. So I'll give this a shot. And I did get, as you read in my bio, I did get one film produced, but I literally wrote like a million scripts, like, and things got optioned and got to different stages, but it didn't feel sustainable to me, like financially, you know. It was it's a tough business. It's a very tough business, but I did learn so much. So structure would be the one thing I learned. Another thing I always sticks with me is the get in late, get out early of scenes, right? We don't need the preamble of, oh, I got out of bed and
Yeah,
rolled or made a cup of coffee. Let's get to the good stuff, right?
yeah,
And don't drag it out either. Get to the point of your scene and then move to your next scene, right? Like that's,
right.
I think that helps pacing so much. And then the other thing is dialogue. I always read my dialogue out loud because I think it makes a difference. I think, you know, you if you don't do that, sometimes you throw in, like, when you're really talking, you don't say someone's name very much,
Right,
right?
right.
You know, like,
You say if you're like angry, you know, it's usually like it uses an emphasis,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like,
You don't just,
hey, yeah, hey,
are you
Joe.
excited?
Like,
Are you excited to go to Thriller Fest, Danielle?
right, right, right.
Right when it's
Yes.
empty. So there's just things that you pick up, you know, trying to get into the goods of the realistic conversation as well. So I think
Right.
those are,
And we don't say, we are going, right? We say we're
yeah,
going.
right.
It's everything is a whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, God, I can't think of the word for those words, but
Conjunction.
there you
Conjunction.
go.
Yeah. And I
Everything's a
love,
conjunction.
love writing. I think that's right. I love writing dialogue and you know, I mean, it's sort of like being in a play, right? When you read
Yeah.
dialogue, I mean, you're playing both parts, but it's really fun to do
And I
that.
can tell that I can tell you have that experience. The other thing I think that it seems like you probably learn is distinct voices, right? When you have a page full of dialogue, everybody can't sound the same. They can't talk the same.
Very true. Very good point.
And
Yeah.
I feel that with Lee, you know, when in Lee and Hazel's, you know, chapters, they're very different women, with different strengths and different insecurities. And I felt that, like, I felt, you know, of course, I think it's always helpful when the chapter says who is talking here,
Right.
because then you don't have to go into sort of, you don't have to done all the extra words about setting us up with the right character. But I
Yeah.
also feel like, you know, the sign of a really well done character is when you could read it and know whose point of view it is, and you absolutely do that. I think that's
Awesome.
fabulous. So,
Thank you.
well, 13 books, absolutely happy, lucky 13. So, since you've done this, like, rom-com and screenwriting and I know, you said it absolutely when you're writing careers, lots of ups and downs. So, what would you say you think is the most challenging part of this business?
I think that it is, for me anyway, it is staying optimistic.
Fair, fair.
Honestly, like it can be quite heart-wrenching. I think there's so many beautiful things about it. But it can also be very, it can be really soul crushing as well. And
Yeah.
social media. So I don't know if you've been writing as long as I have as well. Like when I first was publishing, there was no social media. That's how long ago it was. And it
Mhm.
was a completely different experience, in positive and negative ways. In the negative ways, I didn't have the community I have now. Like I feel like, I feel like
Totally.
we're friends, even though, we met briefly at BoucherCon 100 years ago. Like,
Right.
they're friends I've never met.
Right.
I feel like they are friends, and that's all through social media. There's so many wonderful, supportive people. But on the negative side, when I was publishing pre-social media, I wasn't comparing myself to how other books were doing because I didn't
Mm.
know.
Mhm.
I wasn't reading Goodreads reviews because they didn't exist, right? We didn't know,
Right.
right? So I feel like there's a lot more that comes at us now, that is hard to, I think our skin thickens, but it is a lot. It is
It is so hard. And, and my first book came out in 2000. So it
wow. Okay,
is,
so I was 2004, so you were ahead of me.
yeah. So we had, every queries were paper queries, self-addressed stamped envelopes, questions about whether or not you wanted your paper manuscript mailed back to you or just, it is a whole different world. And I agree with you. There's something I love that the parts about social media that are so great, right, are connecting with one another, which is fabulous. And I had totally forgot that BoucherCon. That was such a crazy, that was Dallas.
Yes, that's my one and
Pre-pandemic.
only.
Yeah, pre-pandemic. But also I love connecting with readers, and it's wonderful to get, people can reach out and tell you how much they enjoyed a book. The
Yeah.
downside is they can also reach out and tag you on a terrible review, and you think, really, like, where's the decency in that? Like, if you didn't love it, fine. If you hated it, fine. But tagging me to tell me how much you hated it is,
Or emailing.
yes, or getting,
I
yeah,
have
like,
that. That's what
yes.
my next book is about. It's called The Haters.
Oh my God,
And
I love, okay, this is a perfect transition. So tell us. I want to hear about this.
so the next book is about a woman who is she's a high school counselor, she's a mom, and she writes her first novel and gets it published. And it's got good reviews, and she's at her book launch party, and this is like a dream come true. And as she's waiting to go on stage, her friend is giving her this beautiful introduction. She looks at her phone, and there's an email from a reader who says, you clearly stole the stories of your teen students, and exploited them to make a few bucks, and you're disgusting. And she's devastated by this.
Right.
And then this person who makes the accusation, it starts to snowball onto social media, and then eventually seeping into her real life. And she needs to find out, who is doing this to her? Is it someone she knows? Is it just a reader? Before she loses her career, and even her safety's in jeopardy, her relationships are falling apart, and it just turns into a giant mess. And yeah,
It's
it's
it sounds like a writer's book. You know what I mean? It sounds like we're
yeah.
all going to need to read it. And plus the fact, working as a school counselor means her job is likely in jeopardy too, like
Yeah,
kind of everything, right?
exactly. So it's also about like how, yeah, like people think, but I told you a story very similar to that. Is that about me? Or
Yes.
yeah, her job. It's like, are you taking secrets from kids who come to you and, to speak to you in confidence? So it's a lot about the vulnerabilities we all face when we put stuff out into the world.
Isn't that so true? And I think it's an interesting thing for people who are not necessarily creative this way. I think
Yeah.
there's a disconnect between understanding that you can form a full story just from your imagination, right? And versus somebody being like, well, the only way you could have gotten to that story
Yeah.
is by hearing it from somebody else. Because and also the idea that there are only so many stories, right? We've got like revenge. There's only so many sort of
That's true.
basic plot ideas.
Yeah, there's
And
only like, isn't it the 7 basic
y-
plots or something?
exactly. Right. So then it's like, so then the question is like, of course it sounds similar to something else because it is derived from one of these 7 plots. And if there's only
Yeah.
7, it all depends on sort of the delivery of the story, which is, belongs to the author. And I think people don't, I think they assume that somehow we're cheating
Right.
because it's like, how could you have written a book that's so similar? But we see this happen all the time. I mean, look at like, Grady Hendrix's The Final Girl support group versus, The Final Girls by Riley Sager. There's there's some similarities there, but they're two 100% different books,
Right.
and executed very differently. And yet there was some hoopla about, was this the same? Was it sort of the same story? Did you steal my story? Kind of stuff. And it's
Okay. All that. Yikes.
yes. Yeah, and it's, it is, I think you can understand, I do understand it, of course, also from the perspective of the author who's protecting his or her own work, right? I wrote the story, and is your story too much like my story? But it is, I think I think people have a tendency to go a little nuts and not,
Uh,
at all understand the way that the writer brain works, right?
yeah, I think so too. And I mean, there's like, that's a concept, being the final girl of a surviving,
Right.
it's not, yeah.
It's
So
not a plot, right? It's not a plot,
yeah,
exactly. And
yeah.
it's a concept that's been around a long time because it was, it's from the whatever 70s or whenever the original Final Girl was. And I'm gonna mess up when that was. So, well, that I love the haters. Okay, so let's just reiterate now where we obviously you can buy this anywhere that books are sold. Where can we find you even though we were just talking about sort of the where can we find you so people can reach out and tell you how much they loved your book only? If they didn't like your book, I am forbidding them from going to find you on the internet or social media. So there you go. My
Yeah.
declaration is, if you want to love on Robyn, here's where to find her.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at R Harding Writer, and Twitter and Facebook is author Robyn Harding. I think that's what it is. Yeah. So yeah, I hope people love it. I had fun with it. The structure is unique for me, telling it sort of in, from Lee's perspective, and then switching to
Yes.
his perspective and saying, oh, here's what was really going on that whole time, which I love doing that. And was inspired by a film called The Handmaiden by Park Chan-wook. It's a Korean film.
I don't know it.
Oh my God. So it's a really out there film, but that's the structure. I think he does 3 parts, and the Drowning Woman is 4 parts. But it's like you're watching a first part and you think you know what this film's about, and then suddenly it goes part 2, and it's like repeats, but something completely different was happening.
Right.
I love that so much. It's sort of based on Sarah Waters' novel Fingersmith, which also uses that.
Interesting. I don't know that one either. Well, and I think the wonderful thing about that structure is that it turns our assumptions on their heads, right? Which I think is something we're all guilty of. And as thriller readers, we're always trying to figure out like, oh, I know where this is going,
Yes.
and then you're like, oh, I had no idea where this was going. So I thought that was great.
And thriller readers, the real thriller readers, are so sophisticated and so savvy. So I literally was writing this book, and I thought there's sort of, as you're reading part one, I think there's an expected victim. And I was going to do that. And then I was like, no, I have to change it. I have to change it. And I made the whole plot of the book change. But I was like,
Yes.
I got to trick people. I'm going to really trick people this time. And I think I did. I think I did.
I love that. I mean, the readers are amazing. I sometimes, I love, sometimes you read a bad review. I've read bad reviews of my books where they're like, I had it figured out in, chapter 3. And I'm like, you did? I didn't even have it figured out in chapter 3. So how is it that you had it figured out? But at any rate, into the world, we put good, good vibes, good grace. It was so fun to talk about The Drowning Woman. I'm really looking forward to seeing you next week. Thriller Fest?
I'm not going.
Okay, I take that back.
I'm so sad. Because The Drowning Woman comes out on the 13th.
Yeah.
The Hate is due August 1st. And I have so much on, and I wish I was there. I was going to be there so much. I've never been. I've never been to Thriller Fest. So
okay, well, Robyn, you have got to make it a 100% in 2024. You just have to. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna bug you about it. I'm gonna keep on you about that. So, okay, well, I will miss you next week. We will toast to The Drowning Woman and to you. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, especially on this crazy week for you. And patience again.
My pleasure. So for everyone listening, this is Robyn Harding. I'm going to spell that because it's a little different. Robyn has got a Y, Robyn, Harding, Harding, with The Drowning Woman. Robyn's hugely talented. It's a fabulous book. Go grab it right now. And we will see you next time on Killer Women. Bye.